Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us in today's session. My name is Cindy Shivak. I am the Director of Prevention Services at Workplace Safety North, and I'm going to talk to you today about CAT. So just to give a little bit of a session overview before we begin, what we're going to be looking at here today is just briefly talking about the health and safety ecosystem theory. So that's specifically looking at the details of health and safety culture and then the occupational health and safety management system component. After that, we're going to talk specifically about CAT, which stands for Climate Assessment and Audit Tool. We're going to go through the stages of maturity, talk about the health and safety factors, look at the CAT infographics, talk about the Institute for Work and Health validation, and then leave on the note of the culture-based health and safety management system approach. So just to make sure everybody's got an idea about that notion of the ecosystem, I just want to bring it back to real life for a second. We're still going to talk about the vein of health and safety, but we're going to use the example that most should be familiar with, and that's around driving. When we look at the concept of driving, especially I know in Ontario and all throughout Canada, we look at the system behind driving. So we don't just get to wake up one day, roll out of bed, and decide, hey, I'm going to drive today. It doesn't work like that. So there's a bunch of rules, procedures you have to follow. You have to go through courses, pass tests that have certain expectation. There's a certain tolerance or a threshold on what's acceptable. We're aware of the behaviors that we need to follow, the signs, the lights, the lanes, all those kinds of things. So all these different pieces are the expectations of the rules that we need to follow. Now, by going through and learning about these and demonstrating your competency through a driver's test and then being issued a driver's license, we're acknowledging that you are aware of these rules, you have the capability to follow these rules, and you have demonstrated that you can do so. So, having said that, we're all in pretty good shape then, right? Because everybody drives exactly the same and we're all really excellent. We all know that that is absolutely not true. And I'm sure maybe even just today, someone went out for a drive and saw somebody else and probably didn't understand how that person actually got their license. This is the ecosystem. So there's one part that has the systematic expectations, and then there's what really happens. Driving is such a perfect example of this because it's one of the most commonly done things that is done most inconsistently, yet the rules are known to all and they haven't changed in a while. I want you to keep that notion in mind as we move through this presentation. So when we're talking specifically about CAT, or the Climate Assessment and Audit Tool, these two components stand true. So again, that culture and then the systems. Just briefly on the culture front, I just want to mention that a culture changes over time. Something can happen today that influences the outcome of the culture tomorrow. This constant changing of the culture or adjustment in the culture is referred to as climate. So when you see the term used throughout this presentation of climate, it's that snapshot in time measurement of that overall culture. So the first piece that we're going to start with, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into, is the culture piece. Now, I'm sure everybody's heard the term culture before. I'm sure it's not something that you've just heard today. We're going to speak a little bit about the subculture of health and safety, the subset of this piece of pie, if you will. So basically, the health and safety culture is a subset of a larger organizational culture that's at play. For example, if you picture an organization's culture being this delicious pie, a slice of that would be health and safety. Now, it's important that we realize there's a bunch of different slices to this pie. Every organization has their own subculture in relation to things like health and safety, ethics, diversity and inclusion, leadership, quality. They all have different standards. They all have different subcultures when it comes to these things. Now, it's important to note as well that all these things do span across the organization, but they do hold with them their own specific set of beliefs, values, and that impact perceptions around the organization and influence the behavior within the organization with respect to those. So, an example there would be, let's say the subculture around quality is really low. Well, guess what kind of behavior you're going to get. So keep that in mind again as we're talking about this and we move through this. We're looking specifically at health and safety subculture. An important thing to keep in mind is how an actual culture develops. So if you picture this red bubble as someone's mind, let's go exploring for a moment. When we look at the first piece, when we look at, again at the culture, the first thing that impacts us as human beings is our experience. We all grew up differently. We grew up in different towns, different provinces, different countries, perhaps. We've been exposed to and raised within different religions, different school type systems, different families. No one here can say that they have been raised exactly the same as another individual, even if that individual did grow up in your household. All those experiences come into play and they make up different patterns in our lives and they impact how we perceive things. So, for example, again, bringing it back to health and safety, let's look at working at heights. So, let's say that my colleague and I are replacing shingles on a roof, and this is the 102nd time that we've done this job. We have never worn a fall arrest system before. This is an example of positively reinforcing negative behavior. Now, I've done this so many times, but nothing bad has happened. So, my experience with regards to believing that health and safety is important, this is something that's coloring it. So, I've done this over 100 times, nothing bad has happened. Therefore, from my experience, I can draw the belief that health and safety fall protection equipment isn't important. I'm sure you can start to see how this can start to get dangerous. Now, let's say we take that same scenario, but this time my coworker falls off the roof and sustains serious injuries. Now, that particular incident would be so powerful that it would create a key experience in my life that would impact me and it would impact the way that I perceive things. So you can see how these different experiences start to shape and mold our perceptions. Now, the next piece to this puzzle is attitudes. People don't walk around with t-shirts that start to list off their experiences and how impactful they were to them in shaping who they are as a human being. That doesn't happen. They also don't walk around with t-shirts that state what their beliefs are. That's just not reality. But one of the things where we can actually start to see these things start to poke through is through someone's attitude. You can see the picture here is demonstrating that wonderful saying of one bad apple ruins a bunch. So this is just demonstrating that attitude component. So when we're looking at health and safety, we're looking at three main attitudes. The first one is looking at the complacent attitude, then compliant, and then committed. So I'm going to go back to the example of driving because again, it's something that we're probably all pretty familiar with. I want you to think about the last time that you went out driving, probably maybe on a highway where there wasn't a lot of traffic lights. What we tend to do, at least here in Ontario, is that we have a really nasty habit of if the speed limit is posted as 80, we have the 14 over rule, which 80 actually means 94. Even though that's not what it says, that's how people interpret it. So what we end up having is we have complacent attitudes as a society when it comes to driving. And it's a really interesting phenomenon because when you look at it, there's not really there's not really rhyme or reason behind why we do it. We just do it because we can. And when you look at the complacent attitude, the big piece there is that, oh, nothing's ever going to happen to me, either because I'm not aware how or what, or I really just don't care. It doesn't really cross my mind. Picture that last time you went out for a drive and really ask yourself, was I going over the posted speed limit? Now, I want you to picture if you were to be coming down a hill going over the speed limit and you happen to catch just the nose of a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. What would be the first thing you would do? You would probably pump the brakes, right? Probably even if you weren't speeding, you would still hit the brakes. Why? Because we look at this compliant attitude overruling the way that we drive as a society. So I'll follow your safety rules as long as someone's watching me. It's the same reason behind the psychology why police will typically even park empty vehicles just to be a deterrent. There's not really anyone in them, but just seeing that visual cue of enforcement causes the behavior to shift. And then the last piece here is the committed attitude. So this is where I will do the right thing even in the moment of choice when nobody's watching. Now that's key. Moment of choice when nobody's watching because I value health and safety. So this really obviously steps up our game and demonstrates someone who is committed to health and safety. Now, I want you to keep in mind that driving analogy that I keep bringing in because these are often some of the first health and safety related exposures that we have as people. So we learn to drive when we're like 15, 16, and these start to form some of our health and safety behaviors. Now, if we take that 14 over attitude into the workplace and we come up with hard and fast rules that you shall not do this, we're bringing in that 14 plus over attitude from the societal exposure. So again, just keep that in mind, and you can start to see how these pieces start to link together. So now we see that the experiences start to shape the beliefs, and then they start to shape the attitudes, which in turn shape the behavioral norms. So the behavioral norms are the actions or the lack of actions that we take. We can see here we have societal influences, personal influences. We don't get to hire people who have only grown up in town XYZ, have had no more than 8 friends. We don't get to do those things. We don't get to influence society. Society influences us. We do have a certain degree of control over the organizational influences, though. When we start to get into the workplace environment, this is where we get to start to establish the expectations of the pieces that we want, the standards that we want people to meet. Now, if I can present this in just a little bit of a different light, as health and safety professionals, we're familiar with what's known as the hierarchy of controls. We look at sustainable ways to impact and make sure that we're controlling hazards as effectively as possible. We work our way down from elimination to substitution, engineering, administrative, and then finally the last line of defense is PPE, which is personal protective equipment. If I can challenge the individuals to think of the hierarchy of controls when looking at this model and asking the question, which will lead to sustainable change when we're talking about changing a culture? You can influence the behavior, you can influence an attitude, or you can influence a belief. Which one of those methods will be most effective? Now, when I look at things like behavior based safety, this is basically cause and effect and correcting behavior. This is way down here. It's the equivalent of honestly PPE when we look at health and safety as a whole. It's not the most effective because you really haven't changed the belief. So in the future, what's the likelihood of that individual actually learning and shifting their belief system from having their behavior corrected? Probably not very likely. So, as health and safety professionals, as leaders, as coworkers, we have the ability to actually start to create really meaningful experiences that will start to shift and shape beliefs, which will then shift attitudes, which will then get us the behavior that keeps everybody safe and healthy. So, again, I just want to leave everybody with that notion around this particular piece. So, the second piece of this is systems. In the health and safety world, we call these occupational health and safety management systems, which is a mouthful. I also, just for the purpose of this conversation, I want to note that health and safety programs is also going to be acceptable here because we're basically going to be talking about that systemic approach, which I'll get to in just a second. So, health and safety programs or health and safety management systems are designed to control health and safety risks. I'm sure we're all familiar with elements like leadership, training, hazard recognition, evaluation, control, inspections, occupational health and safety committees, investigations. All those different elements is what we're familiar with, and these are all designed to control and reduce the health and safety risks. The management system should set out expectations and standards for ongoing health and safety performance, and that should include things like applicable legislation. Obviously, we want to be legally compliant. In addition to controlling hazards, we want to make sure that a well-developed management system is ensuring understanding and creating motivation. Culture, on the other hand, can start to impact the degree of commitment to that system. We can have the most thorough health and safety system in the world, but if the organization doesn't have a strong health and safety culture, that system's going to fall flat on its face and it's not going to be effective. And again, I'm sure we've all had some experience with that. When we look at CAT allows us to actually look at both of those components. So we are looking at systems and we are looking at culture. The other piece around CAT on the system front is that the system component of CAT actually challenges us in our design of the system. And again, I'll talk about that a little later on. So, to get to my point here around systems, is really those of us who have had a hand in creating programs, creating management systems, to really stop and think for a second. What did we create at the end of the day is the key question here. For many years, and I've been in health and safety for over 20 years now, and this is what I've seen. The health and safety world spent an excessive amount of time developing comprehensive programs or systems, and these are comprised of things like really comprehensive forms, checklists, reports, processes, work procedures, safe work procedures, job safety observations, safe work instructions. I can go on, but I won't. But basically, what we're doing is we're creating this cycle of never ending paperwork, and we're really good at it. And it makes us feel good because we can hold it in our hands, we can touch it, we can put our little check in the box, and it creates one again, one of those psychological cycles where we think we're doing the right thing, but we really have to stop and ask ourselves, are we? Are we really? Some of the health and safety standards, programs, and procedures, they're really thorough, but are we really confident that they have the backing to prove that they're actually impactful? Would you bet someone's life on it? And those are the questions we need to really ask ourselves. We've created so many paper-based beasts, and they're good, don't get me wrong. However, we got to look at the behavior that those beasts are creating in us, where they're keeping us in our office, pushing these forms and checklists and writing more procedures because someone missed a step in this procedure. Oh, so we got to do retraining. All these things takes us off the floor and away from the work and away from the people that we're here to protect. The excessive time that it takes to complete all this paperwork prohibits us from proactively managing and matching up the system to the culture piece. We're really doing ourselves a disservice. Again, a message, public service announcement here. Please don't feed the beast. Only give it what it needs. And when you create a beast, make sure that you're focusing on the pieces that we know, backed by science, actually have an impact on health and safety outcomes. And that's where CAT comes in. Things like health and safety legislation, standards, ISO standards, CSA standards, ANSI standards, guidelines, frameworks, all these different things. When we look at them, we really do rely on these things to start to help us set our expectations. So we follow these standards as frameworks. We have to also remember, though, that the outcome we're going to achieve is only as good or as strong as a framework that we're using. So basically, you're using that framework as a measuring stick. Just to bring everybody kind of up to speed, and again, very Cole's Notes version of the history here. Between 2011 and 2015, in the Ontario mining sector alone, there were 34 lives lost. Now, that is substantial. So the combination of these events caused a public outcry to the provincial government, and they were challenged to figure out why this was happening, why this trend was occurring, and to determine the root causes that needed to be addressed to stop the trend and break that cycle. As a result of that, what ended up happening was the Mining Health, Safety, and Prevention Review. So this review took place in 2015, and just to link it back to where CAT came in, there were 6 recommendations that came out of this review. The last one was the glue, and it's called the Internal Responsibility System. Those of you who are familiar with Ontario Health and Safety, the history here, the IRS should be quite familiar to you. The review does go into a brief description around the concept of the IRS being the underpinning of the health and safety system. What the review called for is it wanted the Ontario Mining Association to work with labor representatives to develop an internal responsibility system best practice guide as an industry benchmark to be endorsed by the Ontario Mining Association for implementation by its members. It's a short paragraph, but there's a lot there. When we look at it, you look at best practice guidelines, again, starting to challenge the conventional. How do we really know the best practices are effective? So when we're looking at the IRS CAT pilot project, so IRS again stands for Internal Responsibility System. We did carry it out between the dates listed above for the 6 mining operations. When we look at the number of people we got to speak to, we got to talk to over 2,000 people, which is pretty significant because that was actually over 10% of the mining sector in Ontario. It was really great to see that many people want to participate. And when we ended up speaking to individuals, we got so much insight. And a lot of these operations actually had a participation rate of like 95 to 99%, which you can see is really important when you're talking about validity and representation. Again, we didn't just go ask the mine managers or the CEOs. We actually went all the way down to people who were there as part of the cleaning staff, for example. And the reason we did that is culture is across the entire organization, especially when it comes to health and safety. When you started to look at the best practice statements that the IRS working group came up with, you could clearly see two buckets. One was derived from the world of management systems. What should or is expected to take place, rules, all that kind of stuff. The second bucket was derived from culture. It was the world of reality, the one where practices speak louder than words, the real world, what actually happens. And that's really important to note. So once we noticed those two things, that's where we came up with the ecosystem approach. So the question now becomes, you can verify expectations exist, that they've been communicated, and that they've been met through auditing practices, records, documents, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a practice can be verified through observation, but the frequency of the observation by an unbiased third party to determine accurate occurrence is limited, and is limited to the time that the third party's there. The other thing we could do is we can ask the question to the individual to self-report to their adherence to the practice. But then we get into the issue with what we typically see at the dentist office. I'm sure everybody's been there. Dentist has all its tools in your mouth and hands in your mouth. Hmm, how many times a day do you floss? And we've all been there. Oh, I floss 3 times a day. And the dentist is performing their exam, and they're the ones looking in your mouth, and they can tell that statement is simply not accurate. The same thing happens when you try to measure systems and culture. So that's why we need to ask everyone in the environment. And that's why that preceding slide was so important around those response rates, because we did get to ask everyone in the environment. So, Cindy, you're talking about culture, you're talking about systems, you're talking about ecosystem. So, congratulations, you now have apples and oranges. So, they are different things. How do you compare these? They're all part of the fruit basket. The way that we chose to bring these two in is we assigned a weighted score to the system component of 50% and to the culture component of 50%, giving them each an equal weighting. We did this because we really did want to make a statement that one is as important as the other. Again, I'm sure everyone can see we have gone pretty heavy systems route. And the question is, how impactful has that been? So that's where we made the call to do a 50-50 split. So what we end up with is maturity stages. So when you look at the two streams of these results of culture and systems and you combine these two, it will place you on this maturity scale in terms of your health and safety ecosystem maturity. So you can be placed into a level 1, which is compliant, a level 2, which is passive, level 3, which is calculative, 4, preemptive, and 5 is prosper. Some people don't like the wording compliant or passive, but we did do the research around some of the maturity scales out there. And at the end of the day, that is the behavior that's being demonstrated. So that's why those terms have been used to describe those maturity levels. So now we get into the really data-driven kind of busy slides over here. So what I'm showing you is a slide from the Institute for Work and Health, one of their presentations that they had performed on CAT. There's a series of these graphs over the next few slides, and they're telling the story of the pilot sites who participated with WSN in the IRS CAT pilot. So these sites are anonymous, but what you can see in each pilot is a mining operation in Ontario, and you'll see one of them stand out to the left right here, and you'll see 3 of them riding in the middle, and you'll see 2 on the right. Here, the IRS CAT pilot perception survey had 46 questions, and WSN, as I explained earlier, thought it'd be best to break those out into dimensions that were anchored to those best practices so that they were easier to interpret and we can theme them. So you can see on the left-hand side that there's a pilot site number 4. When you look at the 10 dots, these are the 10 dimensions. And these are D1, D2, D3, D4, all the way to D10. And these are the results from the 46 perception survey questions. The number under each one of those series of 10 dots notified by N is talking about the number of respondents at that particular mining operation. Again, we look at the number of people who responded, and it's over 2,000, which is pretty great. And we did ask everyone in the hierarchy, so it is definitely representative. When we look at the vertical lines that go through each one of these dots, those are the standardized scores, and they represent the spread of responses. You'll also notice that in the middle of the chart is the average across each of these 10 dimensions, and they've set it to 0. So the Institute for Work and Health, I'm not sure how they did the math on it because, again, I'm not the scientist behind it, but what they did is they found kind of that mean, and they did set those sites to 0, and those are the ones that performed on average in the middle. But what we want to draw your attention to is to the numerical difference down the left-hand axis, so the vertical. See the difference between the pilot on the left and the right? So looking at the pilot that's represented in green and that represented in purple. You'll notice the average here of 0, and then you have a positive 0.4 and then a negative 0.4. This difference is called the standard deviation away from the average, and again, which has been set to 0. So what we see here is that the site with the best looking IRS is pilot 4, which again is 0.4 standard deviation above 0. And pilot 3, which is over on the right, has negative 0.4. So the difference between the two is a full standard deviation. So you see how each pilot site is clustered for each of these mining operations. For pilot site 4, across the 10 dimensions, all the pilot sites, so the managers, supervisors, contractors, and workers, they're all voting high in response to the perception of the IRS. And the same can be said in terms of pilot 3 and even arguing pilot 6. So you can see these start to cluster together. So the Institute for Work and Health worked this out even further and noted two themes that stood out when you grouped their intent. The first theme was around management practices, which is represented by the circle. These are things that management does, such as keep workers up to date when there's a change in working procedure. Sounds basic, but it's an example of a management practice. The second one was around worker participation, which is represented by the square. So these are things that enable or provide an opportunity for a worker to participate in health and safety. So something like workers being aware that they have the right to raise concerns to their supervisor, manager, or committee member, and they feel enabled to do so. So that's a practice. But when you look at that worker practice, you can enable that practice systematically, which again we'll address after. The really neat thing is when you start to actually look at the themes and you start to define these and look at the perception questions that make them up, you can actually start to define leading indicators, true actionable leading indicators. What we end up with is these can be created by enabling them through the system or through a process. So the outcome would be effectiveness, and then a measurement of the success could be perception based and audit based, for example. So basically, when the Institute for Work and Health sliced the data this way and boiled down the 46 questions down to two themes, story's still the same. Pilot number 4, strong management practices and strong on worker participation. And pilot 3, unfortunately, they're the lowest. So it didn't matter which way they sliced it, the numbers still said what they did. This particular slide, this is the big one. Okay, Cindy, so what does this mean for health and safety? You're telling me all this data. Well, we all know that results don't lie. Outcomes in health and safety are typically measured in the form of lagging indicators, which we see unfortunately as injuries, illnesses, or fatality. So when we compare it to the frequency of work-related injuries and illnesses, because that's kind of the way that we think this should work out, here's a story. So on the right-hand side, starting from the top down, we have the frequency of work-related injuries over here per 100 full-time equivalents. So you can certainly see that pilot site number 4 has an incident rate of lost time and no lost time plans over the 3 years of 2.59. Now don't forget, pilot 4 was our top performer. Pilot 3 on the right-hand side, on the other hand, you'll notice their injury rate is twice that. So when we're talking about injury rates, the lower the better. We see here from over the 2,000 responses from the mining operations that the perceptions of the eternal responsibility system are at a minimum associated directly with health and safety outcomes in terms of lagging indicators. You'll also note that the ones that landed in the middle in terms of how their IRS stood out, Same thing for their lagging indicators. They're in the middle. So the same can be said. Now, when we start to impose scoring in terms of an audit, assuming that 100% is the best, obviously perfect. So these are represented by the purple stars. So when we look at the purple stars, which is the audit scores, and we look at the push pins, which is the climate scores, which are both leading, and we look at the green, which is the lagging, we see the same trend. So I hope that everybody can see that. What does this mean? It means that we're asking questions about the right things when it comes to the climate piece. It also means that we're auditing the right things because they're correlated with health and safety outcomes. We're no longer throwing darts at a board and getting lost in things like international standards with heavy administrative requirements. We're focusing on what matters and we're focusing on what makes a difference, and we can prove it. In the world of health and safety, short of having a crystal ball, that's huge. To summarize this, Dr. Cam Mustard, who's president and senior scientist for the Institute of Work and Health, states the following. The 46 item questionnaire is sound. The 10 dimensions have strong internal consistency. A shorter version of the questionnaire, 32 questions, which is now known as CAT Essentials, also works well, measuring two factors of management practice and worker participation. The pilot sites are well discriminated by both the 46 item questionnaire and the shorter one. The IRS Perception Survey scores are strongly correlated with the incidence of work-related injury and illness. So what does all of this mean? I thought this quote was probably best to sum it all up, and I use it quite a bit. So it's not enough to do your best. You must first know what to do and then do your best. This really sums up what CAT has brought to the table in terms of where we can go from here. So we put a lot of time and energy into health and safety. Knowing now what factors make the biggest difference will help us cut through the noise and focus on key items to ensure that we have strong positive cultures and that we have effective management systems that truly help protect our people. We often think that legislative compliance is the starting point when it comes to the health and safety journey, but in fact, these pieces, the ones captured here in CAT, should be the first starting points. If we get these right at the beginning of the journey, we'll be building on a solid foundation. Now with CAT, Workplace Safety North at least, we have over 7,000 data points. We've engaged many people across various sectors, aware that the pilot took place in the mining sector, but culture's everywhere. It's not sector specific. So there's a lot of learnings here that could be applied. So once we leaned out the IRS CAT, those 41 best practice statements, we find that the 30 questions can be just as effective, which is where we created CAT Essentials. We also still have IRS CAT, which is 10 dimensions, and CAT Essentials is 6, which is what's being shown here on the screen. If we know the health and safety factors that make a difference and the actions that are attached to those dimensions that we can actually carry out in the workplace, the ones that have been correlated to health and safety outcomes, the true leading indicators that we can action, why would we not start there? If the point of health and safety is to keep people safe and healthy, CAT should be our measuring stick. CAT assesses the health and safety management system in parallel to the climate. It gives you a 360-degree look at your organization to help you prioritize your activities on your continuous improvement journey. And I will leave you with that. And I thank you very much for your time today.